In 1926, the Western Railway of Alabama and the Atlanta and West Point Railroad received their first and only heavy Pacifics, numbers 190 and 290 respectively. Over the next 27 years, these two mighty Pacifics made their claim to fame as they shared honors powering the Atlanta to Montgomery and Montgomery to Atlanta segments of the Piedmont and Crescent Limiteds. But by the early 1950s, dieselization had begun on both railroads, and in 1953, both locomotives were retired from their respective rosters. The W of A 190 met the same fate as other relics of the steam era, at the end of a cutting torch in some local scrapyard. While the newly acquired West Point FP7s assumed their new passenger duties, the 290 was placed on display in Atlanta's Lakewood Park. As passenger service began its decline in the mid-1960s, the 290 was moved to Southern's Inman Yard for storage after being donated to the Atlanta chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. Passenger service on the Atlanta and West Point came to an end on January 7, 1970, while the 290 sat neglected at Inman Yard. There she would sit until 1975, when she was moved to Atlanta chapter's newly acquired museum site in Duluth. For the next 10 years, the mighty 290 was on display at the Duluth Museum in a state of disrepair. But in 1985, the Georgia Building Authority organized the New Georgia Railroad in cooperation with the Atlanta NRHS, and a 290 restoration fund was begun. In 1986, a 3-year restoration project was begun, which culminated in 290's return to service in August of 1989. Between 1989 and 1991, the 290 saw regular service on the New Georgia Railroad, with a variety of trips operated over Norfolk Southern and CSX. But there had never been a trip over the former Atlanta and West Point route. That is, until the summer of 1991. Fannie Flagg's #1 bestseller, Fried Green Tomatoes, was being made into a movie, and the story of Idgie Threadgood and Ruth and Frank Bennett was to be filmed in Georgia. Scouts had selected 2 Georgia towns to represent Whistle Stop, Alabama. Juliet, located on the Southern, about 30 miles north of Macon, was used as the main setting for Whistle Stop. And the sleepy town of Senoia, on the former Central of Georgia, would also stand in as the backdrop for Frank Bennett's disappearance. With the location selected, the producers next needed a train, and negotiations were made with the New Georgia to use the 290 for Fried Green Tomatoes. Filming began in June of 1991 as the 290 made a 50-mile run down the former Southern Main Line to Juliet. With the Juliet filming completed, the 290 returned to Atlanta to await her next casting call, which came on July 7, 1991, as the Atlanta and West Point 290 headed south out of Atlanta over the former Atlanta and West Point tracks for the first time in almost 40 years. After a 42-mile run down the former Atlanta and West Point right-of-way, the 290 headed her short freight consist out of Noonan over the ex-Central of Georgia line towards Senoia. In Senoia, FP7 3499 was cut from the consist and pulled onto the old passing track. Then the 290 coupled up to the train before receiving a touch-up to her movie makeup. With stick-em-back letters and decals, the A&WP 290 was transformed into the Mobile and New Orleans 526 and the Tallahassee and Albany 290 for her roles in fried green tomatoes. With the final makeover touches completed, it was time for lights, cameras, and action, as the 290 pulled ahead for the scene that would end the life of Buddy Threadgood under the old wooden bridge near downtown Whistle Stop. Thank God it's only movie magic. From the time the 290 was donated to the Atlanta chapter NRHS in 1965, it had always been envisioned that the mighty Pacific would be restored to service and power excursions over some portion of the former West Point line. The return to service became reality in August of 1989, but there was a reluctance from CSX for any steam-powered excursions below the Mason-Dixon line. Unlike the rapport with the likes of Nickel Plate 765, steam was not welcome on the southern rails of CSX. All of this was to change in 1990, when the 290 was chartered by CSX to make a run to Jacksonville to kick off the North Florida United Way campaign. After turning in a flawless performance on the 600-mile round-trip run to Jacksonville, negotiations began in earnest between CSX, the New Georgia Railroad, the Atlanta chapter NRHS, and the Montgomery, Alabama Chamber of Commerce to operate an excursion trip over the Atlanta and West Point and Western Railway of Alabama from Atlanta to Birmingham. After 2 years of negotiations, the date for first steam-powered passenger train over the West Point route in 39 years was set. On Friday, August 21, 1992, the Atlanta and West Point 290 sat waiting patiently at milepost 0, the departure point for New Georgia excursions, while the CSX Jacksonville Dispatcher jockeyed both inbound and outbound traffic in anticipation of Extra 290 South. After an hour's delay of the scheduled departure time, the A&WP 290 began her 175-mile journey to Montgomery with a 1992 version of the Crescent Limited. Under overcast skies and a threat of rain, a crowd gathered in Noonan to welcome the 290 back to town. In West Point, the 290 paused for a hero's welcome before heading south towards Montgomery. After a flawless 110-mile run down the A&WP main line, the 290 made a scheduled stop in Opelika, Alabama to take on coal and water. As the 290 heads south toward Montgomery, let's travel back to April of 1990. The 290 has been drafted to substitute for the ailing Norfolk and Western 1218 for the first few weekends of the 1990 Norfolk Southern steam season. While on a ferry run between Birmingham and Jacksonville, the 290 had her first encounter with her former home tracks in Opelika. Between the summer storms and a commitment to attend the annual train show in Atlanta, we were not able to be on hand for the Saturday excursions from Montgomery to Sprague, but we were on hand as the 290 made her return trip to Atlanta. In Opelika, the 290 steamed north past one of the 3 remaining steam servicing facilities that survive on the Atlanta and West Point. In addition to the surviving coaling tower in Opelika, the old water tower in Hogansville and the coaling tower in Noonan stand as reminders of the steam era on the Atlanta and West Point. In West Point, the 290 steamed past another relic of a fallen flag in the guise of a Chattahoochee Valley switcher, with the bittersweet recollection that the Chattahoochee Valley had ceased operations shortly after the 290 had steamed south the Friday before. In Noonan, the 290 steamed northward onto the abandoned coaling tower that in years gone by was a regular servicing point along the A&WP. As the 290 steams north toward Atlanta, we'd like to thank you for joining us for Tales of a West Point Pacific. We hope you enjoyed your trip, and thanks for joining us.